Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the 706 podcast. I'm your host for this week, Tony. This is the podcast in which we collectively seek to make the list of the 706 greatest movies of all time. Right now we have actually 800. So this is just a victory lap. We're just, listing even more movies. So this week we are doing a movie by Paul Schrader from 1985, Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters, a biopic of the Japanese writer Yukio Mishima. So I had pitched this movie 3 times before it was picked. So my co-hosts are chomping at the bit to discuss it, see what all the fuss is about. They may now introduce themselves in alphabetical order. Let's go. Let's try it.
My first or last name?
Oh, let's do last name. Gotta think about it.
I don't know if I'm down for this doxing exercise. My name is Kirk, and I have a social security number of 39876.
Kirk Adams.
I live at 123 Main Street, Columbus, Ohio. I'm a fast food tester. Oh, no. I will introduce myself. My name's Kirk. I am a big fan of Mishima. I actually own the director's cut. It's called Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters and an Appendix. It's far better than this film. Anyways, go ahead.
Anthony. And I am Connor. Might be Connor T, Connor V, Connor Z. You'll never know.
Thank you, Connor. All right, so this is, I believe, everybody's. Well, no, Connor has seen this once before, I believe, and the other 2 have not seen it. So I think I want to get some hot, fresh first impressions. You know what? We got to start with Kirk on this one. This we got to start with Kirk. So Kirk, come on, tell us what it's all about. Tell us about Mishima, the man, the myth, the legend, and the film about him.
Tony, I'm going to try to be more measured. I think that the days of just this guttural mumbling is over. I can't be so reactive. I can't pretend I'm on Fox and Friends talking about, freedom fries. I gotta kind of chill. So let's see. Mishima. So like I was saying to you folks before, in the green room before we're on stage, this is live recorded Radio City, by the way. What I was saying is that I wasn't familiar with Mishima. I feel like somewhat of a, an uncultured layman in that sense. And I was likening it to not knowing, I don't know, perhaps not knowing that the ship sinks while watching Titanic. So I didn't know that he would, he'd kill himself at the end. And one of my criticisms was going to be that the film starts out with a, splash screen of text, and they introduce it by saying, he's taken over this military installment and is rounding up the garrison to speak to them. I feel like the movie would have been better served, just the movie itself, it would have been better served to have kept that secret, because I was expecting it then. And then I think everything that I saw in the 2 hours was kind of influenced by the idea that this person is kind of unhinged, right? Like this person is, what truly is the difference between, I don't know, Jim Jones and Mishima at the end of the day? Like, I'll tell you the difference. One of them was very talented, but I don't know. As for the film itself, right, I think my main critique is it felt too distant to me. The various I don't know how you would phrase them, the kind of portrayals of his works of art, or his, I think there were some were novels and maybe another was a short story. I'm not sure how it went, or a play. He wrote a bunch of different. Tony, you want to chime in on that? Were they all?
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I was just saying it might help to just explain some of the way the movie is basically structured.
Yeah.
So people have kind of a frame of reference
Sure.
for what you're talking.
Sure. So it's like, it's Mishima. He's our narrator. He's telling his life up until this point, this kind of denouement at the end. But anyways, his life is told through his work, specifically three works: the Golden Pavilion, Kiriko's Place, I think, and then Runaway Horses. I want to say those are the three works. I don't know. Forgive me for lack of research. I don't know if those are novels or short stories, but they seemed pretty hefty. Like they had, they were well built out. But anyways, so we get to see glimpses. I guess there's kind of a tacit acknowledgement that Mishima displays his true self through his art. So we're meant to take these as, emblematic of his true feelings, his philosophical perspective, his ambitions. And I would say that those necessarily kind of do align with what seems like these more contemporary scenes that are scattered in between each chapter, that are in black and white, that are taking place the day of this attempted coup. And, also throughout, it shows some other black and white sequences of him, as a child, as an adolescent, as a young male. It kind of explores a little bit his sexual orientation for a little bit, his development of this militia, private army, to defend the emperor. But anyways, getting back to my kind of critique of the film, I feel like throughout the three, I would say there were like three chapters. The fourth chapter, I guess, is what happened in real life. But the three kind of fictionalized chapters, I didn't feel like there was enough world building that took place in order for me to really kind of take anything from them, except the very distilled, very kind of hyper sanitized, abstracted viewpoints that he's trying to convey in his work. Like, it kind of is spelled out for you in the beginning that beauty is kind of this thing that is prone to death and decay, whereas art is like immutable. But also art, you can be vain, you can be not committed to your art. So true art is accomplished through the synergy of art and action. And anyways, it would have worked better if, this is a film where I would advocate for it to be longer, so that these stories could have been fleshed out a little bit more, and we could have gotten to know the author more. I don't feel like I really know who Mishima was, except for these kind of very radicalized, appended views on life, on existence. And I guess from a philosophical perspective, it's enjoyable, but I'm a social worker. I live for the minutia. I live for the nuance that, real life necessitates. And I don't feel like we saw any real life in this film. He was always wearing a mask. He was always on stage. There were very, very brief moments, I think, when he was talking about traveling, when he was talking about how his body, there was a very interesting line about how gay people are very focused on the decay of their of their bodies, and I don't know. I don't think that's necessarily true, but it's just kind of an interesting conjecture, right? So, anyways, I wish there were more of those. I wish there was more use of self, is what I would say. But the stories themselves were somewhat interesting. I think there's just a nihilistic kind of through line that gets a little nauseating at times, and it's like, okay, so all artists should just kill themselves. I guess we should all just kill ourselves. I don't know, but I think it also speaks to, like, I would enjoy this movie a lot more if I were more attuned to Japanese culture and its development post-war, his significance as an author, his ubiquity, like the ubiquity of his ideas or how they were challenged, where he landed on the political spectrum within the political landscape in Japan. We got a piece of that when he went to the university and spoke to the radical left, as he called them, and he preached kind of the benefits of adherence to the emperor's regime or doctrine. And I think that was kind of cool. So I think I was more struck by what was missing than what was there. But I will say the colors were vibrant. Sometimes it feels like when I talk about like the aesthetics, it's almost like I'm talking about the score. It's a little bit better, but yeah, the aesthetic was beautiful. It was an interesting glimpse into a period of Japan that we don't really think about. The post-war Japan, of course, it's highly centralized in other time frames or time periods within Japan's history. Not usually post-war Western art. We don't really see that as much. But as a movie itself, did it draw me in? Did it like evoke emotion? Right. And I think there's something there. There's something to like the kind of the frailty of the human spirit, or I guess the frailty of human desires, but the indelible nature of an artistic spirit, a spirit that's longing for truth, for transcendence. I would want to learn more before rewatching, and then maybe I might appreciate it even more. I think it was well directed. I didn't really have any complaints in that sense, but I don't think the artistic aspects or the cinematic aspects could really overcome what I felt were the shortcomings of the script itself. So that's what I'll share.
Okay, Kirk. Thank you. It was odd because you wrote your dissertation on post-war Japan, so I don't understand why all of a sudden you're playing dumb here. But all right, we'll have some questions for you later. All right. Next, Anthony, who I believe who picked this movie, and who told me that he attempted to watch it but got bored. Probably an attempt to stab me in the heart. But but Anthony, I assume you, first of all, did you make it through the film this time? You got to the end.
Yeah, I've never made it through any of the films until this one today. So
this is your first movie you've completed?
Completely, since Toy Story 3. So
well,
isn't it crazy how those names just start scrolling at the end? You wouldn't expect that. That's like a big twist.
Well, I think Kirk does us all a disservice. We were all huge Mishima the Man fans in college. Let's get that out of the way. All of us devotees, we might say. Let's see. I think, I picked the movie. I think if I remember right too, I think Tony had nominated it with me twice where I had the option of picking it or not. So one of the things, as Kirk was saying before, knowing that Tony wanted to watch this movie so bad with us that he put it up 3 times, which I don't think anyone else has ever done, is kind of interesting. I know the third time was kind of a joke maybe, but it still kind of intrigued me. What did he see in this overall movie? And I'm still sort of asking it. I'm kind of curious what Tony's spin on this is going to be. As for the movie itself, I think Kirk is right in that we don't necessarily know anything by the end, or we're at least left with a couple of major questions about this man as a sort of figure, how he lived his life, or maybe more specifically, who he was, is kind of an open, enigmatic question. I'd most compare it to maybe like I'm Not There, if that's a kind of okay comparison, although that doesn't fully line up. It is, in its own way, a kind of unique biographical film. Now, I said this before, I think, on here, which is like, I'm not a huge Paul Schrader fan. I don't really get him. I don't find his movies that interesting, with the exception of American Gigolo. Like, I could not get into First Reformed or many of the other ones. I just find something too distant, too cold, too harsh about them for some reason. So I was actually very surprised with this movie because I was pretty enthralled from the beginning up through a certain point, and it had me going. I don't know if it was the bright use of colors, these kind of stage-like designs. Like, I feel like I'm watching a theater play with the curtains like all open at all times. But really, for about an hour of the movie, I was just totally with it. And then we started getting more, or at least what felt like to me, more of these black and white kind of moments, and then more intrusive moments with some of the actual narratives, which to me don't actually have that much muster compared to the real Mishima himself. What fascinates me is these moments, which may or may not be true. I have no idea, no basis to judge this of, but these moments where he fights the kid on top of the fence, fascinating kind of black and white flashback scene, other kind of moments that hint at his kind of repression of what may be a sexual moment or not. And kind of these other scenes where he's walking around with the man with the quote unquote duck / club foot. Those are all, like, to me, the more compelling moments of the film, that by the time I get to the end where he finally commits, the ritualistic suicide after being humiliated, after giving a speech, I'm kind of left with an interesting moment, which was, how does the film feel about his traditionalism, his extremism? Are we meant to kind of understand this kind of ideology? Are we meant to understand him in this moment? And what are we overall meant to kind of be left with? And what I'm kind of overall, by the end of the movie, left with is kind of an empty grasping of straws and kind of different ideas, which may be the point of the movie, but I'm not sure. But for me, left me somewhat underwhelmed and unsatisfied. So to me, as someone who hasn't really read Mishima, other than one book and maybe a short story, I found his life just so much more compelling than these kind of narratives that are brought forward from his books. Actually, I don't really care about these kind of storylines with the guy who, gives himself up to save the woman who runs the kind of brothel as a French woman would, is the quote in the movie. Things like that, just, I don't know. So I'm kind of left with a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainties that maybe everyone else could fill in.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. And then finally we have Connor, who has seen this film before. So Connor, how was your second watch of Mishima, and have your feelings on it changed in either direction?
Yeah, the first time I watched Mishima, I think I did have trouble like finding my footing, but I was drawn in as soon as we got to the first story within the story, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, right? As we're being told that story, I was immediately gripped just by the visuals, just the visuals on display, and that, Matt's painted style, which itself kind of like calls back to like Japanese film in the 60s. And it was very cool to me and really shocked me how kind of like authentically Japanese it felt too, like, compared to what I knew of Japanese cinema, but knowing that it was made by Americans mostly, right? It was just really fascinating, or I guess, Japanese crew, and a lot of it was filmed in Japan, and I was Japanese actors, but it really fascinated me, and it kind of puzzled me. I remained very interested in Mishima. I actually read Temple of the Golden Pavilion not too long ago, just out of curiosity. I saw it in a bookstore, and I just thought, like, well, maybe I should like check this out. Obviously, right, that's like a little bit weird, because it's like, shouldn't I have concluded at the end, like, of having watched this movie, that I should not be interested in his work, right? And isn't there something actually kind of perverse about the fact that, right, he's a fascist, like he espoused fascist ideas, right? And he really did make this kind of call to like restore the empire, right, and this kind of thing. These were things he said on record, and he, for a long time, right, he espoused these views, and he did a lot of organizing, and he was like a big part of this, what ended up was actually a pretty large, I think, right-wing group. Now I think what this movie almost asks us to do is to see the complexity of this, and to read it in its full, in its kind of oddness when compared to his written work, right, which is often so much kind of on the side of like, sort of naturalistic fiction that aims at like exposing problems in society, right, that seems to have been like traditionally kind of almost like more of a progressive kind of style of writing and alignment. And Mishima himself was sort of like fighting against traditional Japanese values in many ways for most of his life. So it's somehow very like, especially in his early life, so it's somehow very strange, right, that he ends up where he is. And so I think this movie makes you ask the question of like, it almost makes you see that act and see even his political views not as something ultimately serious, which I think it's arguable whether we should take it serious or not, but rather, what you mean by serious is it was indeed very serious for him, but rather it was kind of like an artistic move, right? It was not that last act he never thought was going to succeed. And there's tons of evidence for this. I mean, think of how, within the movie too, think of how I think this is this perspective the movie takes, where I think about how he talks when he's posing for his photos as, someone about to commit seppuku. He says like, well, like for the French premiere, we really need to make sure there's lots of shadows, So constantly he's thinking about the international audience. He's constantly thinking about his peers, who often are, young people, kind of the younger generation of Japan. And so all of this, kind of longing for the past seems kind of half-hearted and kind of fake in a way, and artificial. And that somehow kind of, for me, kind of takes the edge off and makes me just kind of wonder, like, okay, what's going on with him? There must be something more. And I think this movie just succeeded in making me ask those questions. But that's kind of the subset of it. I think we can get more into. I think the movie wants you to see this as a kind of tragic, kind of self-destructive and futile act. But that one that is very powerful when compared to, for instance, like the act of Mizoguchi, the main character in Temple of the Golden Pavilion, who burns down this temple that seems to symbolize like everything that is beautiful in the world, and this beauty that kind of haunts him his whole life and makes it impossible for him to live the life that he wants to live, right? This issue of desiring beauty and not being able to have beauty, which is kind of that like running theme in his life, especially when it comes to like his sense of his self, right? And his own interest in himself as a sexual object. And anyway, so I'm just getting into the themes of the movie because I think they're so rich, but I think just this movie is very successful for me. I think it's just very good. That's all I can say. Yeah, we can talk about it further, but that's sort of my opening thoughts. I'm really fond of this movie, and I appreciate it a lot more watching it the second time.
All right, we'll end it there because per the rules of the contest, the podcast, whatever the last comment was, controls. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you next year. Thank you, Connor. You do indeed sound more positive than when we discussed it initially when you first saw it. But so I watched this movie a couple of years ago now. I watched it in 2020. And I think the first time I pitched it, I said it was my favorite movie I watched for the first time in 2020, which it was. And this is just this is a Tony movie all the way. This has got this like checks like every one of my conceivable boxes basically. But basically, so it's Paul Schrader, 1985. So he'd done Taxi Driver, he'd done Raging Bull. So at this point, Paul Schrader is one of the more respected screenwriters in Hollywood. He wants to start directing. So this is like I believe his fourth feature. Before this, he did Blue Collar, and he did what's the one about porn? It's Hardcore. Thank you. That's right. I was drawing a blank. Yes, he had done Hardcore, he had done Blue Collar, he'd done a couple other movies as well. Had the backing of George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola, as you see at the very beginning. It's an international co-production working with Japan. He writes the script with his brother as well as his sister-in-law. And it's a moment in his career where he kind of wants to be taken more seriously as a filmmaker, as a director. And I think it's very clear the passion he has for the source material. And to date, he still says he considers it his finest film as a director, though not as a writer. So this movie basically ticks all my boxes. I love movies about people who are pushed to extremes, or people who, in a principled way, go to these, take these extreme actions, like Night Moves, for example, to say the best film we've done on the podcast, the one we've all agreed is the best one, Night Moves, is one example of that. Also, like Night Moves, it's a movie that depicts a process, someone preparing for something, that chronicles it, incrementally, bit by bit. I love that. I love movies that have sort of a unified aesthetic sense, or a very strong, intentional aesthetic design. This movie has a very clear, like, kind of intent behind both its structure and in terms of the aesthetic choices it makes. In terms of, you have the black and white sequences that are basically the straight up biopic sections. You have these very expressionistic, colorful, theatrical sections, which are the sort of the vignettes of the stories, the novels or short stories. And then you have the much more naturalistic color sequences, which show his last day on Earth. The movie cuts, I think, brilliantly between these three different levels, these three different kind of narrative threads at any given time. And I find that just aesthetically very, like, pleasing. Like, I like when a movie kind of structures itself in a unique way and in an intentional way, and is able to pull it off as well as this movie does. But I think you guys made a lot of good points. And I think hearing, particularly in Kirk and Anthony's comments, I hear a little bit of ambivalence about some of it in terms of like maybe not having access to. I think you wanted a little bit more of Mishima's kind of personal, as we've all kind of said, he's always wearing a mask, right? He's always performing, he's always presenting himself in this very intentional way. And we don't get like the intimacy that we might want out of a movie like this. But I think that ends up all working for the movie, because I think this movie takes what is a very like literary theme, a very literary concept of like the tension between the internal and the external, right? And how an individual has to navigate the world, what the individual has inside and wants to convey to other people, and the struggle with communicating one's own ideas and making yourself legible to the world at large, basically. This movie was not a success. This movie cost $5 million and made $500,000. It was not nominated for any Oscars. It was never released in Japan. It still hasn't been released in Japan. Because of the controversy around Mishima himself. So the movie was not a huge success at the time. And I think at the time it got there wasn't a Rotten Tomatoes. I think it was like a 78 on Rotten Tomatoes. So that's good, but not like amazing, that's not like, incredible. So it's somewhat of a divisive movie. And it's a movie that I think does leave some people cold. I think in large part because of, we are left with that question of what are we to make of Mishima at the end of the movie? How does the movie feel about Mishima? How does the movie feel about Mishima's ideology, right? And I think that part of the point of the movie, or part of the intent of Paul Schrader in choosing Mishima as his subject for this movie, is that it feels very alien to us. You know what I mean? Like, Mishima is a fascist, but he doesn't necessarily read that way to us right away, because in a completely different context to us watching it in the 21st century, or even to American audiences watching it in the 80s. This isn't the sort of person you could see speaking on an American college campus. No one's talking about restoring Japan's emperor. So it's this alien, weird thing that we can't quite relate to, which kind of cuts both ways. Because on the one hand, it makes him feel less dangerous, less taboo than he might in Japan, but he also feels harder to relate to as well. So it kind of distances us from him a little bit. And our impulse watching the movie today, especially, is to ask ourselves, where does he fit in? Where does he fit into the modern context? Who would our Mishima be? How am I supposed to feel about it? But I think that the movie almost takes his ideology as kind of beside the point. I think the point is that it's something weird, it's something inscrutable, it's something alien that animates this person that he needs to, at the molecular level, and need to kind of act on. And to communicate to other people in a way that is ultimately doomed to fail, and him having to kind of accept that it's doomed to fail and follow it through anyway. But yeah, so it leaves us in the audience in this kind of weird place where, how are we supposed to feel when we see him at the end of the movie, carrying out this act, right? But I think it is supposed to be, like Connor said, an act of self-destruction. And I think that the movie ultimately kind of pities Mishima, but also empathizes tremendously. Because I feel like when I watch this movie that Paul Schrader made this movie because he feels a connection with Mishima as an artist. Because all of Paul Schrader's movies deal with basically like lonely men who are driven to extremes, right? Taxi Driver is like the classic example of all time. First Reformed has that. The Card Counter has that, the more recent one. This is a theme he's been grappling with for decades. And I think that he sees himself in these characters and is kind of working through things in these different movies. And I think that as an artist, the thing that Paul Schrader responds to in Mishima, or responds to in this story, is just the whole idea of the pen and the sword, and the idea of there being words, there being art, representations of reality, and then there being reality itself. And how do those two things relate and influence each other, right? And is art, what is the value of art? What is the capacity of art to change the world, right? These are genuine, like, troubling questions, right? If you are an artist, right? Because are you not called to do something higher than just to make art for yourself? Is that not just masturbatory in a way, rather than actually trying to make the world in your own image, or try to like make the world a better way in whatever way you see. But the ambiguity we're faced with is like, well, there are people out there who try to do that, but they're insane. They believe like these horrible things. So these concepts really resonated with me, especially at the time I saw this, in terms of like, what does it mean to be an artist? What is my moral duty as a person in terms of doing good in the world, in terms of trying to make positive changes that I see? Because I think seeing this movie, I'm like, how do I know that the positive changes I want to see are in fact truly positive? Filling me with that kind of that doubt, and also that sort of uncertainty about the relationship between art and the real world, and the internal and the external, which are themes that I think at the time I first saw it in particular were really kind of troubling me and really spoke to me, but are also just themes that I've always kind of gravitated to. But I'm always fascinated by these figures that, go to these extreme lengths. And I thought that the way Paul Schrader, the very creative way in which he chose to depict Mishima's life, really blew me away and continues to blow me away watching the movie. I just love the aesthetics of this movie. I think that the depictions of the stories are extremely cool. I find them pretty compelling. I would say that the real life stuff is maybe more compelling, but I love the way the movie cuts back and forth between these different aesthetic styles. It always feels very smooth. It always feels very natural. I think the editing is fantastic. And I just love the dreamlike nature of these vignettes as well. And the way they can just kind of draw us in, and the way that they really lean into their artificiality and emphasize the artificiality of it. So those are my kind of disorganized thoughts. But it's a movie that really kind of spoke to me and really kind of astounded me when I first watched it on an aesthetic and a thematic level. And I felt like, similar to when I watched First Reformed, which I don't know if I like this or that one better, I really felt like Paul Schrader is like speaking my language, or I feel like we have the same like concerns, like the same things on our mind, and the same sort of, I feel like when he makes a movie, he's trying to like solve a problem to himself. He goes into the movie not knowing how he feels about it, and is trying to kind of deal with this hypothetical, or deal with this sort of philosophical problem. And I think that's the way he kind of approaches writing and filmmaking as well. So that's what I like about the movie. But I guess I would say, I mean, we can open it up in general, but like, what is there another version of this movie, I guess, that would be more successful for maybe Kirk or maybe Anthony? So like, Kirk, like what would you have liked to see more of? Or what do you think, like, how would this have resonated with you more?
Let's see. I would have liked to have heard of, because he talks about right before, he says he's always calculating, he's always abstracting, he's always trying to get to the root of everything. And I would have liked to have seen more of him perceiving and assessing the world like we do on an everyday basis, without him having the benefit of being able to think through these things and try to understand their various ideologies, I guess, is the way I would say it. Like, I think I would have liked to have seen, more of him interacting with the West, how his feelings about Western culture. I mean, that they're alluded to, but I know what it's trying to do, but I don't know if I agree with how it's trying to do it. I guess that's the point. I don't think that the vignettes are as stylized or poignant as they could be, honestly. I think there are moments, right? Like when the second gentleman, I forgot his name, he's eating at a noodle shop, and kind of society is swirling around him, almost like he's at the bottom of a drain, right? And I thought that was pretty cool. I thought that was a really kind of stage-like moment. I thought it really emphasized what was trying to be conveyed in that moment, which is that artful depictions of the human body can be immutable, whereas the human body itself is prone to collapse and decay. And I thought that was interesting, because the circle, like this kind of biosphere of human activity or circling around them, and it's like that these people don't exist without being kind of triangulated with other people within their environment. I thought, I would have liked more moments like that. There were a couple ones that just felt confounding, like when he went to the maiden, the first gentleman, the stutterer, went to the brothel, and just inside their room while he's kind of thinking, he's going through some ideas, there's like some of the objects within the room were like distorted and different colors, and it was, I don't know, it kind of came across as like a 1980s after school set or something. It's just very strange. It didn't make any sense to me. I don't know what he was trying to convey in that instance. So I would have liked more stylization of these vignettes. I think, like I said, preempting the film by telling us how insane this person is not a good way for us to objectively approach evaluating this person and their art. Granted, I guess Paul Schrader is assuming that most people who are going to see this film have heard of Mishima, so that's fair. But maybe he shouldn't assume that, and maybe he didn't. I don't know, but it just felt like he did a little bit. And then the way it's divided into chapters, I'm not a big fan of this kind of technique, because you always kind of are anticipating the next chapter, and it's kind of like, you ever seen those like no context spoilers? That's what that like title card felt like to me. Is just like, oh, how is this golden pavilion going to tie in with these runaway horses? Obviously those are titles of a book, but books, but you get little pieces of information. You're going to be taken on a journey, but you don't really know what the journey entails. And yeah, I guess a way for the film to have worked more for me would have been for it to detach even further from Mishima's internal world and really lean into how society perceives this person, leave him as completely like this enigmatic figure who we can't really dissect and discern. We can only see through his actions. But they tried to like straddle the line where, you have some of this internal monologue as well. And I get it. It's like the dialectic, the internal, the external. I think it would have worked well, kind of shifting either primarily external or primarily internal, where we really get to see his insecurities. We get to see his apprehensions and his self-doubts. And I think that Schrader tried to kind of take the best of both worlds. And in 120 minutes, for somebody who obviously had such an effect on a culture that the vast majority of the people seeing this film aren't as well versed in kind of the intricacies of what was going on at the time, I just think it was a little ambitious. I don't know if any of that, what I just said, was coherent, but.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I mean, I would say that the movie definitely is more on the side of the internal. And I think the movie that you describe, that maybe that your preferred movie would lose some of the things that I like about it. I mean, I like that it's sort of like, I mean, I guess I get what you're saying of like a truly internal movie would show us all of his, would be kind of no holds barred in a way. But I think that what he does is with the use of the narrator is sort of like Mishima is kind of telling his own story, right? And it feels a little bit like a memoir or like a suicide note in a way. And the stories are sort of reveal things that maybe he doesn't intend them to reveal, right? So I think the movie kind of successfully depicts the internal, and obviously it leaves a lot of things out. But I think a lot of biopics, where they err is they try to include too much. And I like that this movie kind of gives us a very kind of scant depiction of his life. It doesn't show us, cradle to the grave, every last detail. It gives us these psychologically kind of relevant details. And then it gives us his kind of, narration and stories. That to me went together very well, but I can see how it wouldn't work for everybody. And do you have any thoughts, Anthony, here on maybe on some of what Kirk said, or maybe on what exactly did you have kind of similar feelings, or what was it about the movie that kind of lost you? You said for the first half you were pretty much on board, and then there was a point when you kind of lost it.
Yeah, I don't know if my critiques are the exact same as Kirk, though I do understand a different type of movie that would work much possibly better with Kirk's vision in mind. I think the movie on its own, if you take it for what it aims to do, is a success. But I think in its success is actually there's an unconscious moment where it kind of hints at what it fails to do, if that makes sense. And it's a very key moment. I don't remember exactly which segment it belongs to be honest, but I think it works either way, if whether it's the runaway horses or Mishima's own life, but it's when he visits the prostitute or the kind of the sex worker, and she starts laughing at him, and she says, "Are you always this serious?" And he kind of just keeps going and talking about the ambition of what's going to happen in the next day or two, of how he's going to become a famous name. And this worker keeps laughing and laughing, and he doesn't really respond. But I think that laughter is actually really resonant for maybe the way I was thinking about the movie, which is Mishima, regardless of how you feel about his politics, his devotion to it and his devotion to his worldview is utterly ridiculous. It is so ridiculous to the point that in a real setting, if you're able to understand it from an outsider's point of view, like this worker, you should really laugh at it. And there's a danger, of course, in how you don't laugh at it. Of course, he has his followers and he has his kind of, ending, of course. But really, there's that kind of level of humor that's gone for the rest of the movie, which is we should be actually kind of, I don't think pitying him, but not understanding him should be the kind of key point. And what happens to me and where I start to get lost with this is we have at the very beginning two worldviews presented to us that Mishima seems to believe in, or he claims to, which is words that can change things, and then how people live without words. That is the world. And what the movie, I think, doesn't quite do for me is when I get these segments, I don't necessarily see them as tonally different. I see them only as aesthetically different. And so there is no interest going on with the language and the words. And what it seems to be pulling at is that words actually don't have a meaning and that words don't do anything, that these sensuous novels, by the time they get translated for us on screen in these little segments, have lost all that. And they try to replicate it with a visual that doesn't fully, to me, capture Mishima's point of view as they should in those moments. And all I could do is only think about the kind of utter absurdity of his kind of overall mission, that by the time I get to the end, I feel like what the movie doesn't want to say, but what it gets to is that words are meaningless because he can't change anything. His novels haven't changed in what he claims he wants them to do. His speech, which should be a kind of rousing moment in his own mind, gets kind of turned around and becomes a kind of a joke. And so what we are left with is ritual actions and visuals again. And what I see there is kind of the movie wanting to pity him, wanting to have some degree of empathy of look at this man so devoted to a cause. But for me is only a kind of revel in this is kind of ridiculous. Maybe why I'm thinking about that, I'll give one last moment, is there's a very funny moment in Haruki Murakami's Hear the Wind Sing. He claims it's not about Mishima, but it feels like very Mishima after seeing this movie. The very opening of that book, there's a character who wants to restore America to its empire. So he decides to go to the Empire State Building and jump out of it with a photo of Adolf Hitler and George Washington. And I kept thinking about that for some reason as I saw that ending unfold. And so, I mean, it's a weird thing. I think the movie works, and I see what you and Connor are saying. I see like A plus B equals C. It's just in my own head, I can't get out of these kind of little complaints.
So you think that while the movie kind of tries to pay homage to Mishima's art, or do justice to the art, but it kind of fails to translate and ultimately comes to a place of the words actually cannot affect the world. That all we have is, yeah.
Yeah, I think it kind of actually lacks and doesn't quite fully capture what should be not necessarily attention, but a kind of wanting to work through life with these two views in mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's really interesting, right? Because I mean, I think watching the movie, I mean, when do you feel that his works or his words do change the world? maybe they can, but the thing is that it's not in the sense that, I think, when Tony was mentioning, the responsibility of the artist to be something bigger than themselves, right? We think of kind of the social aims of writers, right? And you'll notice that that's completely absent, right, from Mishima's work. Maybe it was there implicitly somehow. There was an effort to like diagnose the issues of society or something like that. But I think the central move of the movie is to show the fact that this is all about him, right? Even his like search for meaning in the world and in the incidents of other people's lives, we see through what the movie shows us, that it really is about his life, really. And that's a basic kind of like maybe reductive like criticism, literary criticism too. But I think it's really interesting, and the movie kind of it's all tied together in the thesis of the movie that we can explain all this kind of biographically. But I think no, and I think we're supposed to be horrified. And I really like what Anthony says, the idea of like there's no laughter here. Like this should be ridiculous, and that's the danger. I mean, being a right wing, I'm going to revive the emperor. I'm saying bonsai. I'm saying right. I'm carrying a sword around. I mean, it so could easily become ridiculous. How did it not? And how does it not become funny in the context of like the movie we're watching? And that's a really weird thing. That's a question I have to ask. And I feel like reading Temple of the Golden Pavilion, there are moments that make you almost laugh, but they don't. I mean, there's this kind of like, there's this deadly seriousness to his writing and to his view of life, because it's so kind of open-hearted and wounded and touchy and mired in emotions of like fear of rejection and like, all these things. It's so mired in his own, like desire to be loved, that he never has time to like laugh at himself at all. I guess there's moments where he laughs or he makes jokes to his like core of students or whatever. But there's one little detail, actually biographical detail here, that was not added in the movie. In fact, I just read this on Wikipedia after I watched it the first time, that after he stabbed himself to commit seppuku, there's supposed to be the second, who like cuts your head off. And the guy actually failed to do it. The student was so nervous he couldn't do it. And so another guy had to come in and like they had to ask like the kendo champion to like do it for him. And like, so it would have been this kind of absurd, like horrifyingly, darkly grotesque scene. But I almost like that it's like, it's not included in the movie because like there is nothing funny about how desperately he wants to be loved and how desperately he wants his life, not his work, his life, to mean something. He wants his life to mean something through his work. He has no concept of like his work being bigger than his life, I think. Maybe, I guess he does, but it's all about him, at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think the movie makes that kind of that solipsism almost very clear, like early on, even when he says like, he has that picture of, is it Saint Sebastian that he sees, that he's kind of, it's kind of a coming of age moment, like a sexual awakening for him. And it says like, he says like the picture's sole purpose was to lie in wait for centuries until I would find it. So I was like, that's how I feel when I see a movie. I like this movie's sole purpose was to lie in wait for however long.
Then heaven must have been so much more beautiful back in the
when
Bronze
people died. Yeah, exactly.
That was a nice line. I like that.
I mean, I think it's a really cool line, but it's kind of like, all right, less hot guys in heaven. I don't know. Mishima,
although I mean, I guess in heaven you can look however you want. I feel like that, but all right, it's a good line though. I think we're running a little late tonight. I think it might be time to start wrapping things up. So if you guys want to do kind of final thoughts, transition into voting, that would be most welcome. I think we're gonna go. Let's see what order would make sense here. I'll start with Anthony, I guess.
Well, I mean, I kind of gave my thoughts, but actually, let me ask real quick a question, Tony, before I go. But you read another of his books too, right? How did that add anything to
I started Temple of the Golden Pavilion. I'm about halfway through. I kind of stalled out on it. I do intend to finish it, but I've read it, so I have a taste. I've had a little taste of it.
Okay, so this is like one of those things I have flashbacks to. I feel like there's been other examples for other people with movies like this, but this is more than anything. It's like I could see why it's a great movie. I could see why it's a good movie. just for me itself doesn't quite work. If I had gone last, I might have given it a kind of understandable yes, but I feel like since I go first, I'll give it a kind of soft no.
I like that he has to twist the knife by saying, Tony, you chose poorly. So thank you for that, Anthony. Okay then. Well, it's all right. We'll live. I guess we'll throw I guess we'll throw it to Kirk. You know what? No. I'm throwing it to Connor.
Throwing it to Kirk would be the more Mishima-esque move, I think, Tony. Okay, we'll prolong the inevitable. Perhaps we'll see. Yeah, well, what I didn't mention is that all that was a preamble to the things that I did not like about the movie, which are Runaway Horses was a bad choice because it's literally about this exact same thing that he does. I feel like that was kind of like it's just spelling out like the thing that he literally does. Whereas the other two are more interesting because they're like perverse versions of what he ends up doing, right? Or rather, they're almost more sincere versions of what he was doing, burning down the temple because you're haunted by beauty, or becoming this weird kind of sex martyr kind of thing. I don't know what that was exactly. I haven't read that story, but that was really what was on his mind. That's what he kind of fantasized about, and the kind of the Runaway Horses thing is kind of a pale imitation. But anyway, and also the Philip Glass score is trash. Philip Glass was phoning it in, one of his worst scores. No, I'm kind of kidding. I don't love the score, and I don't love Runaway Horses in this, but I do love this movie. I think it's like really powerful, and I'm really glad I got to watch it a second time because it really clicked for me. What's so interesting about it, but I still have this ambivalence about my enjoying Mishima's work and what it means, and I worry about kind of what's happening to me. Like if I like this and what it means about me, and that I can relate to him in a lot of ways. I think it's like probably a bad sign, but hey, know thyself.
All right, I can appreciate that. And Kirk, why don't you bring us home? What's going to happen? Fate's in your hands.
This one's tough. Because I do want to appease Tony, and at the same time, I want to trust my gut. Did I enjoy this film? I mean, it's really a question of how many movies are 706? What will the 706th movie be? Like, if we were to rank them. And would this movie be above or below that? It's tough.
It's Back to the Future 3, as we discussed.
I like Back to the Future 2 probably more than most. But, yeah, so I have to agree with what Connor had said about the last story, feeling, I guess its purpose was to kind of convey what Mishima thought his final act was going to be like, or what it was going to, and then it feels redundant because we're meant to view his final act as an art, an art form or a expressive action. And even the second one, it felt, the first one was really good, the Golden Temple, but the second one is kind of like, okay, so like what? Like, the only way for art to be meaningful is if death accompanies it, and like it just felt so kind of unreasonable in general. Like, why is this man who's kind of interested in boxing now, as he becomes suicidal and he wants his dominatrix to like tie him up and kill him. But anyways, oh boy, Tony, I want to vote yes, but I think I gotta vote no. I wouldn't be true to myself if I voted yes. So
okay. So after hearing him trash Citizen Kane for 15 minutes, foaming at the mouth, calling it the worst piece of shit he ever seen, and voting in it yes, here we have Mishima, where the opposite is transpired. After praising it for minutes at a time, talking about how he's going to get a Mishima tattoo.
I was like the guy that comes in with the big sword, and I almost faulted, and then I actually swung. So I swung true. His head is on the ground.
You should nominate this movie again to Tony.
I think I should continue nominating. I think we should do it like once a year, honestly. But yeah, I am glad that scene was not included of the comical botching of the suicide or the decapitation. But I wish he had shot that scene and included as like an extra feature or something so we'd get it, because that would be pretty funny.
The DVD blooper reel.
Exactly. It'd be under goofs on IMDb. Did you know that when they, and then I also regret not mentioning the score. It has a Philip Glass score, which is very it's very big and bright and bombastic. I'm very bad at describing musical scores, but if you've heard Philip Glass in other movies, you kind of know what to expect. I like it for the most part, but there are definitely times when it feels a little off, a little tonally weird for.
It was weird, but then the ending where it's just the single note repeated over and over again, I loved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it just doesn't give you time to breathe, like in the middle, in the kind of the second act. You just don't have any room, any lateral space for emotional or otherwise, just because the score is kind of hitting you. It's like that South Park episode where they're in the room with Enya blasting and he's like, just like, this is what old age is like.
It should be a little more chill. It needs to be just a little more chill at certain times, but at other times the bombastic nature of the score I think kind of fits the tone and Mishima's self-conception and all this. So I've kind of mixed feelings on it, but yeah, I'm glad we at least addressed it. All right. Well, Mishima is not in the canon. Maybe if I'd only suggested it twice, the expectations would have been a little lower and I would have pushed Kirk over the chain link fence. But alas, I did not. So it is now October of 2022 at the time we're recording this, which means it is spooky season. It's time for spooks and goofs and frights. I don't know, whatever else happens this time of year, candy apples, I don't know. So we like to do a little tradition here where we do a Halloween episode. This will be our third Halloween episode. We've done Monkey Shines and The Empty Man. So this year these three are going to pitch a horror movie or just a Halloween movie to me, and I will select it for next time. So hopefully I'll be able to upload it by Halloween, which will be tough because we have quite a backlog, but we'll see. So trying to think who went least recent.
That was me.
All right, Kirk, why don't you go ahead or pick the order for us?
Geez, I'm real conflicted. I don't know what movie I want to choose, but I also don't want to get blocked out of like a key decade. So maybe, you know what? Actually, I think it's more valuable that I know what Connor and Anthony are going to pitch. So let's go Connor, then Anthony, and then I'll finish.
Great. All right, Connor, take it away.
If you might regret that, Kirk. I'm thinking I might take your decade. Let's see. Okay, so it's been kind of a running theme of the Halloween episode or the pre-Halloween episode that I'm not like very into like the horror genre. I respect it. I think it's cool. But I just have not really delved into that genre myself. So everything that I have to recommend that's sort of even Halloween appropriate is like kind of not, because it's often kind of a twist on a horror thing, or like Monkey Shines where it's one of this extremely weird premise, that kind of thing. So I'm afraid I'm not going to break the mold and I'm going to recommend a movie that is technically Halloween appropriate, but of course, what could be more scary than capitalism? No, I'm kidding. It's a horror movie. Okay, a horror comedy from 2009, written by Diablo Cody, directed by someone whose name I'm forgetting. I'm sorry. The movie is called Jennifer's Body, starring Megan Fox. Okay, and this is a horror comedy, kind of a cult hit. That's Kirk. I think Kirk is like losing his mind. But it is about sort of the relationship of two teenage girls, one of whom is probably possessed by some kind of demon, and sort of kind of belongs to the kind of Heathers-esque canon. It sort of is a funny kind of campy teen film that sends up high school life in a kind of dry, sardonic way, and has other kind of cultural things going on in it, cultural observations and satire going on. And I just think I really like it. I remember like being very pleasantly surprised when I watched it. on cable for reasons that I will not specify, but you can probably imagine what drew me to the movie in the first place. But actually, I was really fascinated and interested in the movie, and I think it'll be kind of an interesting sort of companion piece to Heathers for us to discuss. But yet, it will also still be Halloween appropriate.
Okay, very good. And Anthony?
All right. So this is tough. I've been debating all sorts of different choices. Do I go classic? Do I go horror specific? Do I do, horror comedy? And I got to do something that I think is one of my personal favorites, but kind of mixes everything together. It's 1985's, if I have that year right, 1985's Fright Night, directed by Tom Holland. He's probably more famous for actually writing the script for Psycho 2 and also creating Child's Play, the Chucky, series. But Fright Night, I think, is his kind of masterpiece. It's this very interesting film in which simply a vampire moves next door to a boy. Now, it's a simple kind of plot. It's on one hand a throwback to the 1950s horror films, but he realizes he has to kill this guy. And the only way he could kill him is with the help of a certain man named Peter Vincent, a kind of ode celebration of the Vincent Price type characters. But what it does is actually really does a great job of blending the kind of like horror, the genre that we kind of expect for vampires with the kind of thing that like Scream would eventually do. And I'm not saying it's as bloody as Scream, but I think this is kind of the movie that's going to set that mold. And I think it's a true kind of like overlooked horror, masterpiece from that time. So that's my pick. Fright Night, directed by Tom Holland.
Okay. Same guy who plays Spider-Man, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, good. All right. And then Kirk?
All right. So good choices. What were the decades again? I apologize.
80s and 2000s.
09, yeah, and 80 something, 85.
I think I'm gonna go with a documentary, actually. I don't know. I've always been a big proponent of like, oh, it's Halloween. We should be doing the jump scares. We should be doing this. We should be doing that. But I have a very kind of intriguing pick. It's called Beware the Slender Man. It's about the deadly assault, near death assault that happened in Waukesha, Wisconsin, my hometown, between basically two, I don't know, 10 or 12-year-old girls stabbed another girl because they believed that the Slender Man was telling them to do so. It's very kind of interesting. There are true crime elements, and at the same time, there's more of this meta discussion of how this cultural phenomenon was created and why it became so infectious. And also, like, there's the whole examination of like a social problem, or not a social problem, like a moral panic, I guess you could say, that I guess is undergirded by like a social problem, which is the idea of like the dissolution of I don't know, the family unit, or ubiquity of online creepypastas. You can choose what the problem is that they're investigating in this film, but I thought it was well done. It's not too exploitative. You always worry about exploitation in these types of scenarios, and I guess if you can get over the fact that it's a film about two minors hurting another minor, then you can enjoy this. But yeah, some people just find it gross to begin with, but I think they try to respect everybody involved to the best of their abilities. And also, yeah, I just think it's thematic because it's spoopy. It's about a horror adjacent figure.
All right, very cool. So, all right, so we have three very different choices, which is good. That's what I like. That's what I like to hear. In three different decades. And okay, so let's do some rebuttals. I will say that I have seen Jennifer's Body. I have not seen the other two. So we'll start with Connor then. What do you have to say for yourself?
I think this movie will will have, okay, it'll fulfill the Halloween category. I have to say, I can't remember any of like the horror elements in the movie. I can only remember more of the comedy elements. But what I can say is that, I mean, what I was preparing to say, anticipating the other two's picks, that they would be kind of straight horror movies, was I would say that, well, this one at least, right? Horror movies, I think we get like with Empty Man. I think we got kind of like, we ended up talking a lot about like the movie itself, obviously, which is good, and kind of the filmmaking elements. Did this scare us or did it not? Or was this creepy or was this not? Or like, what are they getting at here? Talking about the genre, I guess we did. So talk about things kind of beyond the movie itself. But with this movie, obviously, this movie is very ripe for our award-winning brand of cultural musings. In the vein of the '90s is the end of history. Spring Breakers. Like invented TikTok or whatever. That kind of thing.
End of history is our Smells Like Teen Spirit. That's how we end every show.
Yeah. So we can do that kind of thing because, of course, Jennifer's Body is sometimes seen as like a kind of kind of a moment of kind of outrageousness from before. Obviously, we're going to be a little bit shocked at some of the things depicted. Relating to teens, right? In the sort of obviously in the post 2014 world. I mean, things changed a lot in terms of what was considered appropriate. There's a new sense of propriety, right, in terms of depictions of kids, for instance, or all kinds of things. So it'll feel a little bit politically incorrect. However, it's also interesting that it was also sort of disliked at the time, often poorly reviewed, but like experienced a kind of resurgence during the kind of Me Too era as kind of a feminist kind of subversion of the male gaze kind of thing. And it became almost kind of like paradigmatic of that kind of tradition or that style, which I think was what kind of like what sort of reigned culturally when we were, say, in college. And I think only now is kind of on its way out. So I think it's kind of doubly interesting as kind of a doubly sort of dated, but yet not that old thing. So I think it's ripe for a lot of, cultural discussion. And I have nothing against the other two. They both sound really cool. I like that Kirk picked a documentary.
Nice. All right, go ahead, Anthony.
All right. I feel like I should switch my nomination to Marble Hornets, the 9-hour YouTube series about Slender Man. But let's see. I don't know. I feel like the documentary sounds interesting, but I feel like what we said to Connor last time we did the October nominations, it's come on. This is the Halloween special, the Halloween episode. So you got to do the true horror film here. Yes, it's a little spoofy. Fright Night. Not saying it doesn't have the cultural richness of Jennifer's Body. I think Connor made a compelling case for that movie. And yeah, there's a kind of internet fascination with Slender Man and that whole mythology that happened. I haven't seen Kirk's movie, but it sounds interesting. And I love the kind of, internet violence kind of connection thing that's always happening in the cultural conversation around there. But I think Fright Night 1 gives us kind of a throwback to something that was going on in the 80s, something that happens with Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, the kind of last great hurrah for these really great practical effects, this huge kind of willingness to like take yourself earnestly while at the same time loving the genre that you're in, loving the kind of stories that these people grew up in. It has a kind of Stephen King feel. It's actually, I'd say, one of the best Stephen King adaptations that's not an adaptation. It has so much going for it that I can't say we're going to necessarily love, but it fits the vibe, fits the theme of the kind of season.
Cool. And last but not least, Kirk, why are these guys wrong? Why are you the Scream Queen?
I don't know. Maybe I get points for unconventionality, I guess. I think there's, like the topic of adolescence and like how an adolescent brain reacts to kind of the large scale propagation of meme culture, of the internet, of how that floodgate has been opened. That we never were really subject to. Like we had certain things. We had very narrow kind of limitation. I guess I'm
speak for yourself. I am 14 years old.
No, but the idea that you can find anything, or I guess when this took place, I think it was like probably 8 years ago, you could really, there's no filter. I mean, the safe search is off. It's just, and how that plays into, or how that informs the fears of parents nowadays, and whether or not those fears are justified. And certainly this movie would do much to kind of, or this instance, right? It's very individual in the sense that this is not indicative of some large scale turn to violence by America's youth, but it speaks to a fear, just like Reefer Madness spoke to a fear, just like you could pick any type of movie like that, like The Exorcist spoke to a fear. It speaks to a fear that a lot of people in our country right now have, just about the wild west of the internet, and how our kids are being corrupted. America's kids are being corrupted by these, these shadowy figures, these unknown actors. And in a sense, that is horrific, both in principle, but also in terms of our overreaction and our overadjustment. And then as far as Jennifer's Body, maybe a second watch would be indicated. I never was a big fan of Megan Fox. I don't think she was a good actor, just full stop. I think it would be kind of an ironic choice. I don't remember that film really speaking to me in any sort of way, but I guess I could investigate it critically through a different lens now, 15 years later. And then Fright Night sounds fine. That could also be good. But yeah, let's do a documentary. I think it's been a minute. Always like the real world stuff. And how often can you say it takes place in your hometown? I mean, it's not like I was born in New York City, so this is pretty kind of cool in that sense.
Well, when I pitched
Not
the movie
cool.
about the
It's not
Toledo
cool.
about the Toledo public masturbator, you guys were not interested. So I'm feeling a little spiteful. No, I'll go one by one. So Jennifer's Body, as I said, I have seen, and I had kind of similar feelings to Kirk. I felt like a loser and a real just Philistine, though, because like Connor said, it was kind of poorly reviewed when it came out, but it's had this kind of resurgence and kind of it's become this kind of cult favorite. And I love when that happens. I think that's really cool when a movie that's kind of initially dismissed will kind of take on a second life or have kind of a renaissance. And I wanted to be part of it. I did, but I just did not find the movie particularly funny or particularly scary or particularly good. I'm sure I'm wrong. I'm sure, I mean, or maybe I'm right. Maybe it's because it's dated now. I don't know. But no, so I'm sorry to say. So I think Connor made a lot of good points, and I think it's the exact kind of movie that it's good for us to do, but I just don't want to pick it compared to the other options, unfortunately.
Oh, you're going to eliminate me. Can I make a prediction?
Go ahead.
That you are not. I think the deck is stacked against Slender Man because obviously we know that Tony wants to make Empty Man a thing, and he's jealous. Slender Man is way bigger than Empty Man.
Well, I'm not jealous. I would merely point out that the Empty Man is the far superior. What would you call him? A cryptid? I don't know. Yeah, beware
We've done Empty Man, we've done A Serious Man. Now we have to do Slender Man, and then we have to do Hollow Man with Kevin Bacon.
We need to do the Thin Man, of course, as well. No, I would say that. Yeah, I think Kirk, you made a really good pitch. Honestly, it sounds really good, and I like the moxie. I like the chutzpah of pitching a documentary for Halloween when we all know nothing scary has ever happened in real life. So I reject that out of hand. But that was a good suggestion. No, it sounds like a fascinating movie, and I think I share some of your concern with, like, the idea of moral panics and social media and this new. As well as just kind of like weird things that happen and how we kind of try to fit them into narratives and all these things. These things all speak to me. And there's definitely a movie that I would watch. But what I'm feeling, though, just past 2 years, we've done kind of like unconventional horror picks. And I have myself to blame for that as well. The Empty Man is kind of an unusual, it's kind of an atypical horror movie. I want this year I'm in the mood for like meat and potatoes. I want just a good, scary, fun time. And I've never seen Fright Night, and I know it has just a banger poster. The poster's great, so I want to watch it for that reason alone. Not because of anything Anthony said, although him saying that it's the best Stephen King adaptation not written by Stephen King did pique my interest as a big Stephen King fan. So
Yeah.
we're going to do Fright Night this year.
I did feel like it was a little out of default compared to the other two, but I'm excited. I'm hoping, that the B movie brings itself to you guys and you have an A to deliver, I suppose, but I'll have what she's having.